Hello, friends. This reflection is for the fifth Sunday of Ordinary Time, and we're actually going in a little deeper as we also take a look at Jesus' early ministry. And what we see here is that he begins forming his apostles as he bumps into Peter, James, and John. What we see here is we see a pair of two themes that really stand out in this Sunday's readings. The first being vocation, and we clearly see that in both the prophet Isaiah, the first reading, as well as the gospel according to Luke, which was chosen for this particular Sunday. So first of all, what is a vocation? The vocation originates from the Latin vocare, which means to call. And of course, people would think, well, is it just for like clergy, like the religious community whatsoever? Not exactly. We're all called to married life too. Like, well, some of us, of course, and we're also called to the diaconate. And sometimes, then, of course, now we're going to probably see an uptick, rather, of consecrated virgins. And let's face it, there have been many saints in the church who, at one point, were virgins. Well, this is more like for women, of course. So, sorry, guys. Anyway. But also, now, it just doesn't have to do with just like, what are you a priest? Are you a married person? Are you a deacon? Are you a brother or sister? Whatever. Or none. But it also applies to a way of life, whether you're married or single, especially as we kind of put in the things that were discussed at Vatican II. And no question, too, that many of the clergy in our church today are trying to welcome people who are married as well as single into the domestic church, which has been preached about from St. Irenaeus. As we look here, we do see in the three readings that there are the three vocation stories. In the first reading, Isaiah had these visions in which he sees God sitting on a magnificent throne, and of course, that's where we get the holy, 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 as we are participating in the liturgy of the Eucharist in the early moments of this liturgy during Mass. And in the end, the Lord is speaking to Isaiah after his lips were made clean, living among the people. But what set him apart is he saw the King, the Lord of hosts. And then of course the Lord asked, "Whom should I send?" And of course Isaiah stepped up for the mission. You see here, what we see in this first reading is that Isaiah is willing to accept the invitation from Jesus. What we see here is that Jesus is calling Isaiah to go about and share the prophecies. Likewise, what we see here too is that we have a mission in life. And that mission must be carried out until we have our final moments here on the face of the earth. We are placed in his vision of creation. And he created you and me in his likeness. You see, what we can take away from Isaiah is that it helps us identify some things to consider when thinking about our particular vocations. You see, Isaiah's call came through vision. But that won't be the case for many of us. Sorry. And sometimes we have to find things like when St. Teresa, she found her Calcutta and she found her calling through that. We look at St. John Paul the Great and how he was called, to lead a country that has been riddled by communism and eventually take that journey and lead these weekend retreats that eventually would plant the seeds for him to begin the teachings on the theology of the body. Now you see here, the second vocation story that we see here is that the call of St. Peter to go with Jesus, to become the fishers of men. Unlike Isaiah's account, there's no vision here. Jesus is the one that's calling Peter. Well, of course, he's referred to as Simon at this point. And what we see is that, Peter and the sons of Zebedee, James and John, they were just coming back from a long night of fishing, worked very hard, yet they caught very little. And here Jesus is saying, go back out and cast your nets. Now, at first, Peter is hesitant about this command. However, he does it. And when he does go out to the lake and cast the nets, him and his fellow fishermen, James and John, had a huge catch. And let's face it, Jesus is astonished. I'm sorry, Peter was astonished. And what Peter does is that he falls on his knees. Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And then Jesus replied, do not be afraid, from now on you will be catching men. You see here, what we see here in this call of Peter is that even though Peter had some kind of relationship with Jesus, it helps us to understand to hear the call and to respond. And it was a step-by-step process. The first step in this request was less demanding, and it kind of required, let's say, like a leap of faith. The second was much more of a response from Peter and his crew. You see here, they had to face head-on the doubts that they had, because they caught nothing, but then Jesus said, go back out there and do it. Even though he was hesitant, they did it. Now, what we see here is that this brings us to our second theme of this Sunday's reflection. You see, we have this theme of humility, and Peter and Isaiah do show humility at this command, like who is going to answer this call. Both of them fell on their knees. And they were told to do not be afraid. You see here, when we look at St. Peter and his humility, when he fell on his knees, Jesus told him, do not be afraid, and to get up. And he invites him to be a fisher of men. You see here is that Peter had a calling, and we're going to see this later as we delve deeper into the Gospels. And let's face it, there are times we're going to be unsure, anxious, or feel unworthy, but Jesus reminds us of these. Well, St. John Paul the Great would shorten it with, be not afraid. And so should we. And what we also look here is that St. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, he recalls that he was on a mission, the preaching of God. He proclaims the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is a state event that changed everything for Paul. Now, he does admit that he's not worthy to be called an apostle. But of course, he was at one point, he was persecuting Jesus and his followers. And he referred to his call with an encounter with Jesus. Now, as we can understand, is that with this vocation, among these three people, Peter, Isaiah, and Paul, is they have one thing in common. They heed the call. Each of them answered in three different ways. For St. Paul, he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus. For St. Peter, he was hesitant, but he wasn't afraid to go out there and do one more casting his nets. In time, he caught a lot of fish. Plenty of fish in the water, they say, right? So, what is humility? Well, you see, C.S. Lewis has, from time and time again, has spoken about humility, but he actually talks about the opposite of humility. Make no mistake about it. Pride is the great sin, is the devil's most effective and destructive tool. He even mentioned it in Mere Christianity. However, there's some good news. Lewis reminds us that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. There's your explanation right there. So, my friends, are we ready to take that first step to humble our hearts, to humble ourselves to hear God's word? Are we ready to heed the call from the Lord to say yes? Mary has done that. Peter, Paul, and Isaiah, they've all done that. Now it's up to you. Now, not all of us are going to be called to the religious life or the holy priesthood or cloistered life, whatever the case is, or married, whatever. But some of us are going to be single. I mean, I'm single, but God only knows what He has in store for me, and I'm hoping and praying that it will may be clear. But here are some things you can do. Go to confession. Develop a personal relationship with Jesus. And frequently receive Him when you attend Mass through the Eucharist. And even better, take a step further and offer an adoration, your next holy hour, to let God pierce through you and tell you what you are called to be. We are all called to be a part of the domestic church as a married person, single, consecrated virgin, even religious or priest. But always remember to heed the call from God. And do not be afraid. Whether you are anxious, unsure, or not worthy, but just give your yes anyway. And I do want to end with one more thing in this video. Frequent prayer, confession, and frequent receipts of Holy Communion will help you grow closer, and eventually that call from God will be made clearer through the silence of your heart. Let it pierce. God bless.